Dive computers and tables. In this module, you will learn how to use the dive tables and the importance of diving within the maximum dive time. See how computers can simplify the management of a dive. Examine some important emergency procedures. And find out what to do to prevent decompression sickness in particular situations. Dive tables. At this point in the course, you already know many secrets about different diving techniques, and you even know how gases interact with the human body according to Haldane's theory. Now, let's examine this in more depth, so we can establish what we should do to make sure the dives we plan are as safe as possible. In order to calculate the absorption and release of inert gases in the tissues, Haldane used an exponential mathematical law. Just one parameter can define it: half-time. This term refers to the time, which is constant, needed by a compartment, a sort of mathematical tissue simulator, to complete half the gap that separates it from a condition of saturation. Initially, through experimentation, Haldane considered the human body as one single compartment, characterized by just one half-time. But the human body is not a homogeneous mass. It is made up of many types of tissues, therefore Haldane finally based his calculations on 5 different compartments, and for each one he established a specific half-time: 5, 10, 20, 40 and 75 minutes. An acceptable level of supersaturation, M value, was experimentally established for each of these compartments. Using the same theory and similar parameters, the US Navy established, for various depth-time correlations, suitable decompression procedures so as to prevent decompression sickness. These procedures were verified experimentally in hyperbaric chambers and then on military divers in the water. These tables were later adopted by recreational divers all over the world. Thanks to these studies, it was possible to establish a maximum dive time for the maximum depth reached on a dive. By respecting these limits, it is possible to ascend directly to the surface without having to make an obligatory stop at a given depth. The PSS dive tables are simplified calculations based on the US Navy tables. Therefore, it is very easy to use them. The maximum depth reached, at intervals of 3 meters, 10 feet, is shown on the top. The grey line below shows, in minutes, the maximum time allowed for that depth. All the values should be approximated to the next greatest whole number. In other words, if you cannot find the exact maximum depth, you must refer to the next greatest number. Let's look at a practical example. You want to make a dive from the beach to 8 meters, 26 feet. There is no column showing this depth on the table, therefore you have to refer to the next greatest number, which in this case is 9, 30 feet. The table tells you that the maximum time you can stay on this dive is 120 minutes. If, however, we decide to make a dive from a boat to a maximum depth of 16 meters, 52 feet, the maximum time for the dive is reduced to just 40 minutes. Remember, when you refer to depth, you must consider the maximum depth of the dive. Even if you go to 18 meters, 60 feet, for just a few minutes, and then spend the rest of the dive at 9 meters, 30 feet, you must consider that the entire dive is carried out at the maximum depth of 18 meters, 60 feet. This is why it is important that our depth gauges also indicate the maximum depth as well as the actual depth. The tables are designed for square profile dives, meaning that the entire dive is spent at one constant depth, and, contrary to a computer, tables cannot be used to calculate what is known as a multi-level dive, when different periods of time are spent at various depths. When you make a multi-level dive, you should always reach the deepest part of the dive first, and then dive progressively shallower. You must avoid what is known as sawtooth or yo-yo profiles, where you constantly change from deeper to shallower depths and vice versa. It is extremely important to respect the rates of ascent and descent indicated on the tables. When using the PSS dive tables, the rate of descent is 20 meters per minute, 65 feet per minute, and the rate of ascent is 10 meters per minute, 33 feet per minute. The maximum dive time given on the PSS tables includes the time it takes to descend and the ascent up to a depth of 5 meters, 15 feet. The tables do not take into account dives where you have to fin hard against a current, get very cold, or maybe don't feel very well. As a precautionary measure, in cases of cold or fatigue, you should refer to the column 3 meters, 10 feet greater than your actual maximum depth. When we surface after a dive, we need time to eliminate the excess inert gases still dissolved in our bodies. According to the PSS tables, this requires 12 hours. If we want to dive again before 12 hours has passed since our last dive, we make what is referred to as a repetitive dive. As we already have a level of excess inert gas in our body, the maximum time for the repetitive dive is reduced, depending on how long we spend out of the water, a period of time known as the surface interval. If you stay on the surface for less than 10 minutes between the first and second dive, you can consider it as one single dive. If the surface interval is more than 10 minutes, you must use the table that refers to repetitive dives. Under the maximum dive times for the first dive, there are horizontal white and grey bands showing the surface interval times. The maximum dive time given for each depth is reduced to take into account the quantity of excess inert gases still dissolved in our body tissues. As you will notice, the minimum interval between a first and a repetitive dive is 41 minutes. Therefore, you must spend at least 41 minutes on the surface before you can make a second dive. Another important rule regarding repetitive dives is that the second dive should be made at least 6 meters, 20 feet, shallower than the previous one. If, for example, you made a dive to 18 meters, 60 feet, the repetitive dive should not be deeper than 12 meters, 40 feet. The maximum dive time for a repetitive dive depends on the length of the surface interval. If 2 hours and a half have passed since you surfaced from the last dive, the maximum time you can stay at 12 meters, 40 feet, is 33 minutes. If you want to dive longer, you must increase the surface interval time. If, for example, you want to dive to 11 meters, 36 feet, for 40 minutes, you must refer to the 12 meter, 40 feet column, the next greatest depth, until you find a time greater than 40 minutes. In our example, you can see that 45 minutes corresponds to a minimum surface interval of 2 hours and 59 minutes. If the surface interval is greater than 12 hours, you may consider any dive that you want to make as a first dive. Dive computers. Dive computers give us many advantages in respect to the tables. These instruments make all the calculations in real time and assess the situation of the gases in the compartments moment by moment. Multi-level dives will therefore have a longer duration, and repetitive dives do not need a minimum surface interval. On switching on, the computer checks the condition of the battery and usually indicates the gas mixture to which it is set, air or nitrox with a percentage of oxygen greater than 21%. During the dive, the display will indicate the actual depth you are at, the elapsed time, the maximum depth reached during the dive, and the time remaining of the maximum dive time, which should never reach 0. If you ascend a few meters, you will see that this time increases because you are making a multi-level dive. All this information is updated in just a few seconds. Computers have numerous audible alarms that call your attention to important information, such as, for example, a fast ascent rate. Some computers penalize a too fast ascent rate by reducing the maximum dive time. Although many computers measure the water temperature, they cannot know if you personally feel very cold during the dive or if the dive is particularly strenuous. In these cases, you should dive more conservatively. Safety stops and emergency decompression stops. Now we will examine why the maximum dive time includes the ascent up to a depth of 5 meters, 15 feet. On all dives, it is strongly recommended that you stop on ascent at a depth of 5 meters, 15 feet, for 3 minutes to make what is known as a safety stop. This procedure reduces the level of supersaturation in the fast compartments, those with shorter half times. Safety stops are also usually shown on computers. This stop also gives divers the opportunity of checking the dive tables to make sure that the depth and dive time have been respected. If everything has gone according to plan, it is enough to just complete the safety stop and come to the surface. If the maximum dive time has accidentally been exceeded, then an emergency decompression stop must be made. The procedures are simple. If the dive time exceeds the maximum dive time indicated on the tables by less than 5 minutes, you must stay 5 minutes at 5 meters, 15 feet, after which you should also carry out the 3-minute safety stop. If the dive time exceeds the maximum dive time indicated on the tables by more than 5 minutes, you must stay at 5 meters, 15 feet, for as long as possible, but not less than 15 minutes. Once again, it is important to remember that these are emergency procedures and not procedures to be planned as part of the dive. And talking of emergencies, let's now look at what you should do if your computer fails during the dive or indicates information that is certainly incorrect. If, before the computer failed, the dive time was within the maximum dive time, it is enough to ascend calmly to a depth of 5 meters, 15 feet, and stay there for at least 5 minutes. If, however, the maximum dive time remaining was 0, or, worse still, the instrument indicated that you had to make an emergency decompression stop, you must ascend and stay at 5 meters, 15 feet, for as long as possible. In both cases, before diving again, you must wait at least 12 hours, or better still, 24 hours. After diving. The dive is over and you surface. On the surface, the computer will display new information. For example, it will indicate the time needed for the compartments to eliminate all the excess inert gas. If you dive again before this time has elapsed, it is a repetitive dive. Another sign that might appear is a crossed out airplane or the word "No". This indicates that you should not change altitude, as you need to do if you fly in an aeroplane or drive up a mountain, before the time indicated on the computer has elapsed. If you make a dive using the PSS dive tables, you should wait at least 12 hours before changing altitude if the dive is not repetitive and does not involve an emergency decompression stop. You should wait at least 24 hours in all other cases. It is also important to remember that these tables are calculated for dives carried out at sea level or up to 300 meters, 1,000 feet, above sea level. For dives higher than this, you need to follow particular procedures that you can learn by attending a special course. Dive computers have a special function for diving at altitude, yet another advantage of using a dive computer. In the next module, you will learn more about the underwater environment, particularly waves, currents and tides. Learn how to assess potential dangers of marine fauna and techniques you can use to help protect the environment. And examine some enjoyable diving activities. Until the next time.